My Lords, I'm speaking to move Amendments 36 and 46. I'd like to thank... I was very pleased to hear the Noble Lord Blencathra be so kind about my previous comments, and then I remembered it wasn't him speaking. But whoever said something nice about the points that I was making then, good. I feel slightly awkward because I should be, in some ways, saying that I had a win from committee, but here I am again. So, Amendment 36 seeks to insert a clause that will mean that an accountable person must take steps to ensure best financial value for leaseholders and requires the Secretary of State to issue guidance to ensure that that duty is taken seriously. And this is to focus the minds on the dangers that we've seen throughout this bill, that in the name of safety, in a bill taking on the grave injustices suffered by leaseholders for having to pay for building safety remediations, that sometimes the solutions, inadvertently, might create even more layers of regulations and bureaucracy that are disproportionate, overly precautious and risk-averse, and will result still in spiralling and never-ending set of additional costs for leaseholders. At committee stage, when announcing the changes the bill after committee stage, when announcing the changes the government were making to the bill, the Secretary of State Michael Gove said, "We have listened to leaseholders' concerns, removing the requirement for a separate building safety charge and scrapping compulsory safety managers to avoid unnecessary costs." How brilliant, I thought, and when the Minister then told me that there would be now no building safety managers, I have to confess I was delighted. This was the first amendment that I'd ever tabled to abolish the building safety manager role, and I'd had a win. But just before I got the bunting out, or was allowed to indulge in any backslapping at all, I was brought to a pause by leaseholders who noted, and I quote, "Small gains towards fairness, decency and common sense do not equal an overall win. The battle is very much ongoing." So let me say here, it really is important that the government has listened, and any caveats that I raise now, a little like the Noble Lord Blencathra has mentioned, are not intended to be churlish. But it's precisely because I take the Minister and Michael Gove's assurances that they want to ensure that there's no unintended outcomes from the bill in terms of avoidable unnecessary costs, that I've raised this amendment, which I think gives a chance for guidance to push home the point, and that is that leaseholders, a value for money for leaseholders, is a very important thing. This is not all just about my fears about what might happen or leaseholders being paranoid. At a sector conference, Leaseholder London 2022, Sean Lundy, a chartered health and safety practitioner and a supporter of building safety managers, reflected on what removing that role would mean. And he said, "The bit that worries me a little bit is some of the onerous duties are still there. So even if you've got rid of the role, it still leaves a void about who is going to do the work." And he worries out loud about the danger of creating, quote, "a disproportionate industry and another layer of bureaucracy, especially in relation to the new duty of creating safety case reports," noting that already, while some reports he'd seen were sensible, others were, quote, "completely over the top," and gave the example of a 50-page report for costing £50,000, creating a report, as he said, with no tangible benefit. The building safety manager, therefore, might be dead, but for some, it's long live the building safety manager and their duties. And I think that Dame Judith Hackett's call quite early after Grenfell, that it was not good enough to wait for law change, but freeholders had to act, has led to something of a panic reaction and has often been taken literally. So just to give you an example, I want to tell you the story of Aviva leaseholder Sarah from Quadrant Block in Salford. With no law passed, her managing agent, Contour Property Services, have charged her and her fellow leaseholders for a building safety manager. What's more, they've also appointed an additional building safety coordinator. In correspondence with leaseholders, Contour writes of balancing value for money against taking appropriate measures to meet new safety requirements. And then the killer line tells them that almost casually as an afterthought that as a result of these appointments there will be an increase in your service charges. And then there they are in the small print for the forthcoming year from April 2022 to March 2023. And if you look at the small print in this bill that I've got here, we see that the building safety manager is there at £21,249.50 and the cost of the part-time safety coordinator is £11,702.56 and it's charged to the leaseholders. This might be blatant, but even if there's no direct mention of the building safety manager, they're lurking in the shadows, it seems to me, rebadged or slightly in disguise, but nonetheless ever present. And all the heavily administrative substance of the duties that they were meant to take part in remain in the bill. And many of these duties are based on the precautionary principle, sadly interpreted through the prism of zero risk and often disproportionately focused on myriad possible risks rather than clearly defined dangers. So in Sarah's case, one of the listed duties is writing and maintaining the building safety case for the building that shows all potential risks have been considered and mitigated. All potential risks, my lord. Never mind the cost of the building safety case itself, but who will pay for resolving all potential risks? So the question is the removal of the legal requirement to appoint a building safety manager strong enough to stop them from effectively being imposed? So this amendment asks the government to note that the genie is out of the bottle, but the Secretary of State has the opportunity to ensure in guidance that the sector should not just rush to a risk-averse, costly solutions because they've once been suggested, and instead focus on whether cost is really proportionate to real risks and ensure value for money will be a barrier to costs just being dumped on leaseholders via service charges or other nefarious routes. Of course, it is not all about money. We have to consider human costs too. There's no point in knowing the cost of everything and ignoring the non-monetary value of homes for people, discussed so eloquently in the discussion around the amendments in Group 1. Amendment 46 focuses on tightening up the ability of freeholders, landlords and managing agents on forcing entry into leaseholders' homes. And when I raised this at committee, I do think there was understandable concern. People wanted to say, well, what if there's an emergency? You need to be able to enter. We can all think of such instances. I know that happened with a burst pipe in a flat above mine and water emptying in and pouring into the flat below and so on. You want to be able to get in and turn the water off. But this should be a last resort, and this modest amendment simply aims to reinforce that point and to give leaseholders some power in that decision. At present, despite limited rights for leaseholders that has become more and more clear since the whole building safety issues come into the public realm, landlords are under an implied obligation, as an ideal, to give the tenant or the leaseholder quiet enjoyment of the property and should not interfere with that. But if you read the literature around building safety, you'll discover there's an increasing clamour challenging the idea that leaseholders have any rights to stop entry into their homes, presenting leaseholders as obstacles to safety. For example, in the Safer People, Safer Homes Building Safety Management report a couple of years ago, there are complaints that leasehold units purchased by their owners are not culturally accustomed to the notion that landlords have jurisdiction over their homes. And the landlords complain that access for owners and agents is just too difficult. Extraordinarily and insultingly, the assumption is that behind leaseholders' front doors, they are all behaving as fire hazards, irresponsibly ignorant of risks. Leaseholders are painted as ill-informed problems. To quote, most will have no comprehension as to fire or other safety principles and their place in the matter, and they then demand timely intervention on a statutory basis is needed to enable prompt access in order to monitor and assess risk and conditions. My concern is that all these checks and monitoring and assessment will mean demands for entry beyond any reasonable bounds of common sense. Leaseholders themselves are anxious, and the government press home that this is not encouraged, and that the government asks key questions of landlords. So Amendments 46 and 47 restrict the power to enter people's homes unless it's essential, and makes it clear that the court must be satisfied that it's necessary to grant entry only in extreme circumstances, not just because an accountable person has sent a notice demanding entry for building safety purposes, so vaguely defined that they could include anything from the overuse of scented candles to fridge inspections. I'm just waiting for smoking in one's home to become a listed fire risk, although I don't want to give that idea to the government. So a final plea that leaseholders' property rights are not just to be shooed away, and a final reminder, one that I'll return to later, that we should avoid pushing a narrative that assumes all blocks of flats are inherently dangerous, at high risk of fires, creating a climate of fear that then justifies surveillance and monitoring of leaseholders in their homes, and the reorganisation of everyone's lives around hyper-safety and zero risk, at great costs financially, great costs in the human sense to civil liberties and the privacy rights of homeowners who are unfortunate enough to be leaseholders as well.